G'day everyone and welcome to the Trekzone Spotlight. Well, it's been 6 months since today's guest joined me. It is, of course, Carlos Pedraza, and he's at home for me today. Carlos, thanks for your time.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Now, the State of Axanar. We keep coming back to this, despite the fact that the lawsuit's been over for over 12 months now. What's happened? What's happened now?
Well, you know, the lawsuit is over, but Axanar is not over. I would love to have to stop covering Axanar. But the reality is, and I've said this before, that, you know, they're gearing up to raise more money to produce the two Axanar short films, and that money is coming from people, and people deserve to know what the history of this project, the history of Alec Peters, you know, what he's said, the discrepancies and the things that he talks about. They deserve to know all of that before making an informed choice about whether or not to invest yet another hundreds of thousands of dollars into a project that couldn't get made after having successfully raised $1.4 million.
Now, this has all sort of come about in the last few weeks because at the start of the month, Alec and a few people from Axanar went to a convention of sorts at an Atlanta shopping centre where he said some very interesting things which we're going to dissect through today. What was your highlight from that panel discussion?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, one of the things that Peters says once the article came out was that I didn't say anything I haven't said in other venues on my blog and so forth. But the reality is that, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that he said, and but there's, you know, discrepancies that have come up between what he said in the past and what he's saying now. And, you know, there's the whole troubling notion that somehow that persists out in the world that Star Trek Discovery was inspired by or took ideas from Axanar, and that Axanar is the reason why we have Discovery, when that's not true at all. And while he doesn't make that claim, he neatly tees it up for an audience to be like, well, you know, I don't know, but I do know that Brian Fuller is a big fan of Axanar, when in fact he's not, but you know. So that's the kind of stuff that I cover. I mean, a lot of Axanar supporters think that what I'm trying to do is you know, uncover some sort of conspiracy, when in fact all I'm doing is documenting what he says and what he does, so that, you know, when the time comes for them to raise money, people have open eyes about what they're giving their money to and who they're giving their money to. That was my purpose in covering that speech, that panel discussion, you know, to see what he had to say about how soon production is starting and what that production looks like, where it's going to take place, and, you know, how it relates to other fan films. And he covered all those topics neatly during that panel discussion, and so that's what I reported.
The thing I'm fascinated by is the fact that he keeps name dropping. So apparently Jason Isaacs and Doug Jones were tapped to be in Axanar. There's Brian Fuller was a big supporter of Axanar. Justin Lin and J.J. Abrams apparently were big supporters of Axanar as well. What's with the name dropping, do you think?
Well, you know, it's a very Hollywood thing. You know, the more names you can drop, the more credible you come across. And following the lawsuit, in which Axanar and Alec Peters took a big hit on their credibility, you know, following the loss of their studio, in which he sunk $750,000 of donors' money into building, and not a frame of Axanar was ever shot inside that studio. All of these things took a toll on his credibility and his project's credibility, and so he's been working to rebuild that credibility over the course of the last year. And part of that is being able to say publicly that he's connected in some way to these people whom his audience they know who they are, and they respect them, and is able to, draw respectability through his connection. But in point of fact, if you parse the way he talks about all of it, in the case of Jason Isaacs, he never even talked to Jason Isaacs. He just says, again, after the fact, that he was interested in getting Jason Isaacs cast in Axanar. He never says which role, and this is the first time we've ever heard of it. What he says is that his girlfriend knows someone who knows him. So, that's like 3 degrees of separation. And I've got 3 degrees of separation from almost anyone famous in the world. So that's a non-story, but he gets to drop the name of a well-regarded Star Trek actor. Similarly with Doug Jones, Peters probably has met. Doug Jones is very fan-friendly. He's been in almost everything. So I have no doubt that he talked to him, but how close that came to actually being cast is left completely vague and ambiguous, because of course that isn't the point. The point is to rebuild credibility, and so the more names he drops, the more credibility is built. At least that's how the theory goes. And finally, with Brian Fuller, and we debunked this a year ago, that he keeps claiming that Brian Fuller is a big Axanar fan, and in reality, Brian Fuller was directly asked, before Discovery premiered, is the event that Discovery was based on, that's referred to in the original series, is that event Axanar? And Brian Fuller said directly, "I don't really have any idea about the history of Axanar," making it quite clear that Axanar doesn't really mean anything to him, and and he's a sufficiently creative guy, Brian Fuller, that he doesn't have to steal ideas from a copyright infringing fan film.
And a lawyer in training who came up with the expanded idea.
Well, the idea, remember, comes directly from another licensed property, the FASA Star Trek game. That's remains the inspiration. In the tape of the panel discussion, Alec Peters refers to the Klingon War that we came up with. I'm like, no, I think actually that Klingon War was come up with by a licensed Star Trek vendor, FASA, and he took that idea. So it's not an original idea he came up with. Garth is an original. The Klingon War is an original. The time setting is an original. He keeps trying to draw some kind of connection between the time Discovery is set in, the time Axanar is set in, and saying they're in the same time frame. When the reality is they're not. They're in the same time frame as the fictional Prelude was fictionally produced in a fictional universe 10 years after the fact. So the events portrayed in Prelude actually happened 10 years before Prelude is set. So that's 10 years before Discovery and its version of a Klingon War. So he keeps describing it as somehow two alternate visions of the same universe when it's set at the same time, when in fact Discovery is set as far away from his Axanar world as Discovery is set from the original series.
Well, let's move on to one of the many comments that he made, but this one in particular in regards to the lawsuit, where he said that CBS and Paramount missed the bigger picture of Axanar and what could have been told. It sounds as though he wanted to be the pre-show entertainment to Star Trek movies. Was that ever going to happen, even if it wasn't a fan film, do you think?
Well, no, that's just not the way that it works. His point that doing something like that would break the Hollywood paradigm. Well, sure, but there's a lot of things that would break the Hollywood paradigm that aren't necessarily a good idea commercially. And so if the point is just trying to disrupt things, you have to go further, which is his claim that it would have made Star Trek more money to have gone down that road. But we have no idea if that's the case. I mean, he just sort of presumes that fans love Axanar, therefore more fans would come to have seen Star Trek Beyond. We have no idea if that's the case. I mean, we do know that the fan film audience is a niche of a niche of a niche. So would we really have seen that many more butts in seats in theaters for Star Trek Beyond? I don't know. Do you know? Does he know? Is there any evidence one way or the other? No, there's not. Not to mention the fact that, it raises all kinds of legal issues. The idea that on an ongoing basis, fans produce things and CBS or Paramount buy them and then use them to make money on their own. I expect a lot of unions out there would have issues with that. If the ultimate goal is to for a network, a major network that should be paying union rates for everything from crew to cast and writers and so forth, is essentially getting it made on the cheap because they've kind of outsourced it to fans. And then, it puts fan films, which are supposed to be a labor of love, into a very tricky financial and legal position should the studios have embraced Axanar in the way that Alec Peters suggests. They're all major hurdles, and without any compelling evidence that it would pay off for CBS or Paramount, it's just speculation. It's red meat to his fans who believe that, if CBS had just bought Axanar, then all the problems of the world would have been solved. And the reality is that CBS and Paramount are two separate entities, and Star Trek Beyond is a Paramount production, not a CBS production. And so CBS buying it wouldn't have made it automatically available to Paramount to place ahead of theaters. And and the other thing is, Beyond was a long enough movie. They're going to add a 20-minute feature to it. There's just theaters can't have screenings last that long because it decreases the number of screenings they can have in a day, and that means they lose money. So, so one of the ideas Alec Peters talks about in this panel discussion is how he could have instead used Axanar or Prelude as an online teaser to get people to watch. To go to the theaters to see Star Trek Beyond. But the reality is that even, by the point that all this was happening, Prelude had already been out online for over a year and a half at that point, and maybe even 2 years at that point. So there was no product to place in front of Star Trek Beyond that hadn't already been out in the world and gotten lots of publicity and lots of views. It wouldn't have been anything new. So it's a dubious claim propagated without any real evidence to support it.
The thing that sticks me with this whole situation is the fact that Alec is still uncontent to be just a fan production. Axanar has to be this big thing. If you strip away everything else, everyone has to admit that he's trying to make this bigger than it actually can be, should be, needs to be. It's a fan production. It should be 2 by 15 minutes or 1 by 30 minute, released online, and we all move on. But we're still here, 3-4 years after the original announcement. Okay, there was a setback with lawsuit and all the rest of it, feature films not happening, but we're down into the guidelines now. It's been 12 months. I've managed to rewrite a script 5 times to make sure that I got facts right in my story, and I'm moving into production in a month's time. So, and that's just me. I don't have a chief of fulfillment. I don't have all these people. I don't have a massive fan base waiting on every word that I'm saying. So what makes us so different? What makes Alec so different to every other fan film producer out there? I could rattle off a whole ton.
Well, it's the scope of the ambition. And to his credit, to Axanar's credit, they proved that there was a scope that reached out widely and broadly and deeply into the fan base and into the rest of the world. And I don't have a problem with that. I don't. I mean, I don't have a problem with, prior to the guidelines, the kind of production that he was aiming for Axanar to be. What I have a problem with is making money from that, creating revenue streams from that. In the panel discussion, he claims he made no profit. Well, a judge found otherwise. And I quote that in the article, exactly what the judge said in his finding that Alec Peters, in fact, did profit financially from Axanar and the fundraising or revenue earning streams that he created, the online store, or the retroactive donations and so forth, as they were called. These were all money-making ventures, not to mention the studio itself, which had, his intent with that was for it to become an operating commercial studio that would be used for future original productions of his own, as well as rented out to other productions to earn money. Those are all activities that the judge looked at and came up with his finding. And the idea that Peters didn't make a profit in the sense that, you put so much money into something and earn so much money back, and if it's more than the money you put in, that's a profit. I think the idea is, and what the judge was talking about, was that you have created revenue streams that have put money into your pocket, much of which is to this day unaccounted for, and that's not something you should be able to do with the copyright, the intellectual property that's owned by somebody else. Peters continually tries to make this narrative about the studio suing fans, and the reality, I've told you this before, the reality is the studio wasn't suing fans, it was suing one fan, one guy who was profiting off of their intellectual property. And to try to broaden that, and again, he makes this same argument in that panel discussion that all the fan films were doing it, and it's a question of degree, and of course it has to be a question of degree. Were there other large fan productions that were bringing in a lot of crowdfunding, that were bringing in professionals to work on their productions, that were bringing in actors, Star Trek alumni actors in to play roles? Yes, that was going on. But every other one of those productions, whenever CBS said, you've got to stop this or you've got to stop that, they did. Axanar was the only one that refused to do that. Therefore, Axanar, and continued its revenue generation. And so therefore, Axanar was the only one that was sued.
Well, and I don't think James Corley would have received a license to convert his sets into a museum piece if CBS were so aggrieved by him. And by the same token, I don't think Vic would have, or I don't think Vic would still be getting work in the industry now if he'd have pissed off CBS and Paramount as well. It really is that degree of separation that, okay, maybe Alec was trying to do the same sort of thing as Continues and New Voyages, but he took it that one step further, tried to create the business model out of it, and not just something like Starbase Studios, where he was trying to get Star Trek fans together to make all sorts of productions. He was trying to make an independent studio to make independent productions which are free from any sort of overwatch from CBS and Paramount in terms of money making and all that sort of jazz. So it was really interesting of the judge's comments to read that profit isn't necessarily cash that you've made on top of what you've spent. Revenue is about all the other tangible things that have come from you raising money off that, equals all of this stuff. So I think
Peters said himself, just weeks after his meeting with CBS, in which he, tried to get guidelines, he claims, from them, and he claims they refused. And, just weeks after CBS put out a statement warning him and Axanar about continuing to make money off of, I think the term was commercial ventures trading off our property. And they were saying that directly with regard to Axanar. And just a few weeks after that, he said in a podcast interview that the studio was the end game. That's his word. That's really what they were trying to get out of all of this activity was, yes, Axanar, a feature film that fans would likely have enjoyed, but in his pocket, metaphorically, also a commercial studio built with donors' money that he could then use for whatever he wanted.
Well, we're coming to a point now where Alec says once again that the script is locked and production is going to start, and we're going to start seeing frames of vision sometime this year. Do you believe it?
Well, I mean, based on the track record, I'd say no, because there's still a lot of obstacles that have to be overcome before he can even begin production. And, in the panel discussion, again, he goes on and on about how much progress they're making, and they have a script, and they brought Paul Jenkins aboard, a respected writer, to hammer the script into something better than it was. And that this is all good news. And I'm not saying it's not good news for the production, but what I am saying is that he's neatly avoiding all the things that still stand in the way. He has no director. Rob Burnett resigned. He has no announced cast. He has no announced crew. I know for a fact that he's been calling everyone in his Rolodex to ask them to work on Axanar, the short films, and he's been getting a lot of refusals. Maybe some acceptances too. I don't know about that, but I do know that I've heard from sources that he's been calling them and trying to get them to come aboard, and they haven't. And of course, the largest obstacle to overcome is the money. He estimates it will be $200,000. Well, again, that figure, those goalposts are always moving. When he first announced it, he said it was 150 based on how much Prelude cost, and this was going to be 10 minutes longer than Prelude, so that proportion would be the amount that they'd have to raise on top of that. But of course, he neglects the fact that Prelude actually cost $123,000, which was almost $10,000 more than was actually raised to make Prelude. And therefore, if you use his own formula, the amount that is needed to produce these short films is actually closer to $200,000. And so a few weeks later, he says in a podcast interview that the amount will, probably be closer to $200,000. So like so many of the times that he uses numbers, with time they tend to drift ever upwards. The amount that he supposedly put into of his own money that he put into the project started out at 75, and then was 100, then 125, then 150, and these days it's 300. I don't know. And again, there's never any documentation given of all this. We will likely never see a budget. We're not entitled to, but we have to take his word for it.
I think that's the biggest thing too, is that, as you said, we're not entitled to see the budget. And I had this same conversation with Ray Tessie a few weeks ago. It's really no one's concern where the money comes from or how the money is spent on a production, except when you become this public figure, you make such a ripple in the fabric, in the waves of Star Trek fan films, which, as you said, is a niche of a niche of a niche, that it's about time that you are just open with how things are said. I don't really care about every line in the budget, but when, for some reason, Alec needs $200,000 to make 30 minutes of content, I know Nick Cook over in the UK would love to have that sort of money. Gary O'Brien would love to have that sort of money. Aaron Vanderklay, myself, would all love to have that amount of money to make 30 minutes of production. But it's not needed. And I don't understand why Alec says it is, and I think...
Well, I don't have a problem with the amount, honestly. If he's able to produce something of the kind of quality that he claims if it costs $200,000 and he's able to raise $200,000 to do it, then fine. I don't have a problem with aiming that high in terms of the ambition of the quality of your production. What I have a problem with is the demonstrated inability to actually execute that. He was able to execute Prelude because of the work of a lot of other people whom he has since driven away, and none of whom continue to be associated with. Every person in a major creative position on Prelude is gone. Director Christian Gossett, gone. Editor Rob Burnett, gone. New editor Rob Burnett, or new director Rob Burnett, gone. Writer Bill Hunt, gone. For him to say that we can still produce this because we've done it before, when none of the people who actually made that happen are still around, is a dubious proposition. And so again, I don't have a problem with the ambition. I only have a problem with the demonstrated inability to deliver.
I will agree with you there that if he can raise that amount of money and he produces a fantastic product, good on him. But I guess that I come back to, and I've sort of taken the guidelines from an Aussie's perspective, where I've been trying to make fan films for, I look back at it, I've been writing fan fiction for 12 years. In Australia, it's a little bit more difficult. Our fans are a little bit more isolated from each other, I guess. The internet and Facebook and Twitter have all, closed that in a little bit. But in terms of getting a group of fans together to make a fan film, it's really quite impractical here in Australia. So when those guidelines came down, and I said it all along, and John Van Sitters liked the way that I interpreted it compared to some other people, that it really was a levelling of the playing field for everyone around the world to jump in front of a camera, put a uniform on and produce a fan film. But I think that it's gone all the way down with the guidelines now, or all the way along the path with the guidelines now, that if you have one or two of these big productions with big donors backing them to raise more than they're allowed to through public crowdfunding, and they can produce a better product for that, well, cool. And that's going to be just as good as Continues and New Voyages episodes coming out. But as you said, make no mistake, I'm not trying to compare Axanar Light to Continues on New Voyages, but in terms of that quality and that excitement for that release, and there are the fans out there who call you and I, Carlos, and everyone else in our group haters. There is that dedicated fan base that is going to hang on every word and wait for these productions, and power to them, and good luck to Alec, I guess. But as you said, the track record is there that he's not going to deliver.
So that's where my skepticism comes from. And, I'm not going to go so far as to say he can't do it, because I don't know that. I don't know who he's going to be able to bring on board to do it. Eventually, he needs a director. He's going to eventually find one, and maybe that person will be a great director. But the track record says that he drives away creative people. So it makes me skeptical. And, the more opaque the production appears, the less confidence I think he's able to inspire amongst potential contributors. The obstacle that raising that $200,000 raises for him is a huge one, because he can't do it via crowdfunding. He can only do it via private outreach. Obviously, that begins with reaching out to the people he has in his database, so all the prior donors. But frankly, thousands of them have become so disillusioned that you can't automatically say every one of those 15,000 people who've supported Axanar in the past are going to, give even more money in the future. You just can't say that. All you have to do is look at the number of contributors from the original Indiegogo campaign to the last Indiegogo campaign, which was intended to save the studio in which so much of the donors' dollars had been invested, and he barely got more than 300 people to to donate, around $22,000, and then spent that money closing down the studio and moving it and the sets and everything else across the country to Georgia. And one of the things that we find out from this panel discussion is he started making those plans in February. He says so himself. And the problem with that is that he began his Save the Studio Indiegogo campaign weeks later in March. So he was already planning on that crowdfunding campaign failing, so that when it did, and remember, he started out with this being a Kickstarter campaign, and he changed it at the last minute to an Indiegogo campaign. Why? Because Kickstarter is all or nothing. You either raise the money that your goal is and you keep it, or you don't. And Indiegogo lets you keep all that you are able to raise. And he was hoping that to raise enough money to fund the move out from California to Georgia, and Indiegogo was the only one of the two crowdfunding platforms that would have allowed that. So that last minute switch from Kickstarter to Indiegogo, I think, is worth being skeptical about. And the fact that he's now admitting that he started making those plans weeks before the campaign even began. And then you look at the marketing campaign during the actual crowdfunding effort, and it was nowhere near the kind of outreach that Axanar had previously shown in its earlier crowdfunding campaigns. I mean, it was really a lackluster effort. So it's no surprise that if you look at a graph of the donations that were coming in for that last crowdfunding effort, they go like this, halfway through, basically grinding to a halt. So that to me gives me a clearer notion of how much support Axanar actually is able to inspire amongst people.
Well, let's move on now, because the other topic that I wanted to chat with you about is an article from Newsweek that came out a few days ago. It's an interesting one that says Star Trek should be in the public domain, and basically is pro-Axanar and that the lawsuit shouldn't have happened. What are your takeaways from that article?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, it glosses over some important facts about Axanar. Its central idea is that, and I don't necessarily disagree with this. I mean, its central idea is that some intellectual property becomes so ingrained in society that people should be able to be creative with it. And that's what fan films do. I was a fan film producer. Technically, I was infringing on Star Trek's copyrights, but we were able to come up with things that, won, major awards, were recognized in major media, and, and were smiled upon by CBS and Paramount. Obviously, they couldn't come out and officially endorse it, but they let it happen because it was a demonstration of the love and creativity that fans can, in fact, produce about this intellectual property. So I don't have a problem with that notion. I've always kind of subscribed personally to the idea that fan films should fall under fair use. Unfortunately, the law, as it's currently interpreted, doesn't agree with that. But the real problem with copyright isn't copyright. I think this article seems to say that the essential problem is copyright, and that the people, like Cory Doctorow, whom I respect quite a bit, who challenge the whole notion of copyright. I'm a film producer. I produce feature films, and I need to be able to earn a living from that, and I can't do that if the more successful I get, the more that allows people to profit off my work. So I have a problem from that. I mean, the whole purpose for copyright is to give producers, creators, a financial incentive to create, that they get for a limited period of time, exclusive rights over how their creations are used. I don't have a problem with that. The problem I do have, and where I think there's some common ground here, is the idea that these days that limited period of time has gotten very long. Decades and decades and decades, beyond which is probably reasonable for a copyright holder to expect to hang on to exclusive use of their intellectual property. And so I'm all for copyright reform that looks at bringing that time period to a more reasonable level. Disney is famously the one credited with getting copyright extended because they didn't want to lose their control over Mickey Mouse and other of their intellectual properties. But now it's gone to an absurd length, and there's definitely some reform that could be made in terms of that length. But in the article, the author says, under the original copyright law that was created 200 years ago, Star Trek would have come into public domain in I think 1994, he said, and the idea being that now it's so much longer and it's awful. Well, you have to remember that the lifespan of people at that time, was 30s, early 40s. People now live easily twice that long. So extending the amount of the human lifespan, average human lifespan in the United States was extended through the 19th and 20th centuries. That extending the time period that creators should be able to earn revenue off of their creations should be extended as well. And I don't have a problem with that either. In principle, it's just we've gone too far to that end of the pendulum, and I'd like to see us kind of come back. Because at some point, and the Founding Fathers recognized this as well, at some point, this intellectual property should come back into use by the public. It should inspire people to be creative and so forth. But, this article makes it seem somehow that people getting to use Star Trek would be this amazing creative flowering, and I don't know that that's true. I think what you'd see is a lot of knockoffs, and probably cheap knockoffs, trying to make money off of the name, and I'm not sure how creative that would actually get. So, not to mention the logistical issue with, at what point do you measure when an intellectual property gets to cross into that land where everyone gets to use it? I mean, right now we have that limit set by law, but Star Trek's supposed to be some kind of exception. And at what point do you say, now's the time? Now you're good enough. You've been so successful. Everyone else should get to profit from your success. To me, that's problematic. I think the idea behind copyright is to encourage original creations, not to allow people to copy and create derivative ones.
Well, Carlos, it sounds like we've reached a philosophical point in the discussion, so let's leave it there and open it up to the viewers to comment on the video over on YouTube. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on copyright and public domain and all that sort of stuff and goodness, and also Axanar as well. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of comments on this video in regards to our coverage of Axanar. But Carlos, as always, man, I really appreciate your time today.
Always a pleasure.
If you liked the video, give me a thumbs up. If you disliked it, as some people seem to do on every video, give me a thumbs down. Subscribe by clicking that icon and click the bell icon as well to get notifications of when new Trekzone Spotlight episodes are out. I'm Matt Miller. Thanks so much for watching today.